Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last day of the 2026 Annual Conference and Book Fair in Baltimore. I'm Michelle Morano, a member of the AWP Board of Directors. I've been on the board for 3 years now, and in that time, I've been constantly blown away by the dedication and hard work and thoughtfulness of the shockingly small staff that puts on this conference every year and that supports the writing community in so many other ways throughout the year. It's an honor and a privilege to work with them and with a fantastic group of volunteer board members. The Association of Writers and Writing Programs is a small but mighty nonprofit organization that amplifies the voices of writers and the academic programs and organizations that serve them, all while championing diversity and excellence in creative writing. Although I'm a member of AWP's Board of Directors, I'm first and foremost a member of AWP. I joined in 2002 when I attended my first conference in New Orleans and was blown away by the panels and readings and conversations that made me feel truly that I'd found my people. If you are not yet a member, we invite you to become one today. We're delighted to bring you today's event. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Center for Fiction for this panel and their support of the conference. Our literary partners and sponsors allow AWP to present these extraordinary literary events and help us keep our conference affordable and accessible. I have just a few reminders before the event. Please respect the seats marked as reserved for attendees with accessibility needs. Please give the authors about 10 minutes after the presentation to get to the book signing table just outside the room before approaching them to have your book signed. And please remember to silence your phones. Thank you, and it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Melanie McNair, who will introduce this fantastic event.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming at the Center for Fiction. How many of you have heard of the Center for Fiction before? Oh, amazing. Well, it's a 200-year-old cultural organization. Our mission is to support readers and writers of all ages and histories and build community through fiction. All of our programming, reading groups, writing workshops, a 60,000 volume fiction lending library for our members, our bookstore, our cafe, are places where community can gather, work, and connect. Our writer studio provides creative space and community for working writers. For our youngest readers, we introduce K-12 youth in New York City public schools to contemporary books and authors through our Kids Read program. And we support the future of story by supporting early career writers through our nationally recognized First Novel Prize and our citywide Emerging Writing Fellowship. We have a beautiful home in Brooklyn. I hope you come and visit us. And a lot of what we offer can be accessed online as well. I've had the privilege of hosting all three of these amazing authors when they launched their books, and I have to say it is a dream to bring them all together. I love the work these writers have brought out into the world, and I'm excited for what will come from this conversation. And our writers are Rabih Alameddine, the 2025 winner of the National Book Award for fiction for his novel, The True Story of Raja the Gullible and His Mother. He's also the author of Comforting Myths Concerning the Political and Art, the novels An Unnecessary Woman, The Wrong End of the Telescope, I the Divine, Cool AIDS, and the Hakawati, and the story collection The Perv. His books have been translated into more than 20 languages. His most recent awards, aside from the National Book Award, include the 2025 Bill Whitehead Award for Lifetime Achievement from the Publishing Triangle, the 2019 Dos Passos Prize, the 2021 Lannan Prize for Fiction, and the 2022 Penn Faulkner Award. He is co-editing a book of international short stories that's coming out later this year, and he divides his time between his bedroom and his living room. Katie Kitamura's most recent novel is Audition, a finalist for the Booker Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award for Fiction, and longlisted for the Women's Prize. It was one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2025. That's the list we all want to be on, right? It was a finalist for the Gotham Book Prize and longlisted for the Joyce Carol Oates Prize. Her previous novel, Intimacies, was one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2021 and one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2021. It was longlisted for the National Book Award and the PEN Faulkner Award and was a finalist for the Joyce Carol Oates Prize. In France, it won, I'm going to mispronounce this, a very important award, and was a finalist for the Grand Prix Lerwin and was longlisted for the Prix Fragonard. Her third novel, A Separation, was a finalist for a New York Times notable book. Her two previous novels, Gone to the Forest and The Long Shot, were both finalists for the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award. And to bring these amazing writers in the conversation together, another amazing writer. Mecca Jamilah Sullivan is the author of 3 books, Big Girl, a New York Times Editor's Choice and winner of the Balcones Fiction Prize, and the Next Generation Indie Book Award for First Novel. The Poetics of Difference, Queer Feminist Forms in the Africa Diaspora, winner of the William Saunders Scarborough Prize from the MLA, and the short story collection Blue Talk and Love, winner of the Judith Markowitz Award from Land Literary. She has earned honors from Breadloaf, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, the Mellon Foundation, the Center for Fiction, where she was one of the first cohorts of emerging writing fellows, the NEA, and others. Originally from Harlem, she is professor of English at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Let's give them a huge, warm welcome.
Yes, so welcome everyone. I think we'll start with a short, kind of brief-ish reading from both of our incredible authors, and then we'll jump in for a conversation. Do I go up and read? Yes? Okay. Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. It's my first time at AWP. This is my first hour of an AWP, and I just can't think of a more wonderful context to be in. Invited by the Center for Fiction with 2 writers whose work I admire so tremendously. Thanks to all of you for being here very early on the last day of what I know will have been a long couple of days. I'm just going to read for, I think we're told 10 to 15 minutes from my most recent book, Audition. I lost my voice about 2 weeks ago, and it's been slow to come back, so I apologize in advance for the hoarseness. And my book is about a woman who's very much in the middle of her life. She's an actor, she's happily married, and her life is kind of overturned when a stranger approaches her, a young man, and tells her that he believes that he is her son. And from that point, 2 possible narratives unfold, one in which he is her son and one in which he is definitely not. But I don't think you need to know that to follow this passage. All that you need to know is that she's in rehearsals for a play that is directed by her friend Anne, and that the young man is called Xavier. Xavier asked if I'd been able to immerse myself in my new part, if that process had taken place, and I looked up at him, startled out of my thoughts. He was gazing at me with a placid expression, not in the least as if he were asking a sensitive question, and yet he had touched upon something that was in fact a vulnerability. He had found with unerring intuition something that was now beginning to trouble me. I wondered how innocent the question was, if Anne had said something to him, if she could also tell that things were not progressing as they should. It would have been fair for her to be concerned. We were 3 weeks into rehearsal, and I'd had an unusually long time to prepare, and yet I still felt myself too much to be playing a part. I couldn't seem to locate the center of the role. This wasn't necessarily unusual. In the past, there have been plenty of parts that have continued to elude me, even as the work as a whole improved, whether through my own failing, or failing in the writing, or the direction, or something else altogether. The alchemy was particular, and the truth was that there were many occasions when it went awry, or didn't cohere. I'd come to see it as something of a crapshoot. You never knew if this would be the one when everything would come together, or if it would fall by the wayside, another disposable performance, the detritus of a soon-to-be-forgotten artistic endeavor. But in the case of this part, this production, I had every reason to hope for the best. Not only was I working with Anne, but the play had been written by a playwright I had long admired. She was a young writer, exceptionally brilliant, I'd seen an early production of hers at a small theater downtown that seated no more than 80 people. The theater was half empty the night I went, but even in a half-empty theater with a cast of unknowns, I knew that she was an extraordinary talent. Tension grew out of every scene, scenes in which nothing took place, and people said very little, and yet the pressure grew and grew, so that by the end of the play, I realized I'd been in a sickening state of unease for some time, and when I emerged from the theater, I was simultaneously invigorated and physically exhausted, every nerve in my body still standing on end. Of course, I immediately called my agent and asked her to arrange a meeting, and not too long after that, I spoke to Anne, who had also seen the young playwright's work and been similarly impressed. However, everyone had been by then, so it was by no means assured that we would have the opportunity to work with her, much less that she would make a new piece with us. But as it turned out, after nearly 2 years of expressions of intent and little more, she suddenly called me and said she had something. When she sent me the play, I knew from the first page that this was a part for me, the one that comes along only very rarely, and that if I was patient and careful, it could form the basis of the best work I had ever done. But then, after the first table read, and after the early rehearsals and the later rehearsals, and even as Anne and the playwright herself extolled the virtues of my interpretation, even as the pieces began to fall into place, and the shape of the performances began to emerge, and even as I began to see in the not-too-distant future the point at which the emergence would cease, and the structure of the work begin to ossify, so that although some movement would remain possible, its essential parameters would be set, even then I had the sense that I was still too much clinging to the shore. The part, the world of it, continued to elude me, and I knew that the window of opportunity was closing, that I had to make some shift within myself, or the role would slip away. I'd been silent for some time, and now I said, "There's only 1 more week of rehearsal, and then we go into tech." Anne said that you're already excellent. "I'm not where I need to be," I said to Xavier. "I'm waiting for something to happen, and time is running out." I moved my head uneasily. I didn't know why I was telling Xavier this. "There's always a chance that the breakthrough takes place later," I said, "but I'm starting to fear I won't get there." He nodded sympathetically, as if he understood what I was saying, although that seemed unlikely. I hardly knew what I was saying myself. "It's not through any fault of Anne's," I added, "and the play itself is wonderful. It's me." "But what if you're actually good?" Xavier said. "Does it matter how you feel?" "Of course it matters," I said quickly. But even as I spoke, I found myself uncertain. Did it matter? It mattered in the sense that the work was what counted, not the activity that surrounded it, the energy that collected or dissipated upon its reception. But I didn't know how to separate the work from its effect. I recalled a recent film centered on a performance that had seemed to me so extraordinary. It had recast everything I knew about the actor, whom I had previously found rather uninteresting, despite his storied career and reputation. As he had gotten older, there was a palpable laziness to his work, the sense that he could no longer be bothered to rouse himself to his former heights. He was always playing some previous version of himself, the version that had won the acclaim and sealed the reputation. But in this film, in Salvation, he had produced a performance of rare depth and complexity, recalling the promise he had showed at the very start of his career when he still seemed moved by ambition and curiosity. He played each scene with painful caution, reaching out to touch a table, a counter, as if seeking to be grounded. I could feel the character's turmoil in almost every instant on screen. He would look down and then up again, and there would be an expression of such confusion on his face that it was not too much to say that my heart broke as I watched him. I had to admit that I'd been wrong. He was in fact an actor of remarkable subtlety and commitment, and I subsequently agreed to work with him. But soon after we arrived on set, to my surprise, I found that he was as vacuous and vain as I had previously thought, and as we began to rehearse, I felt a jolt of distress. He seemed to have little sense of the scene, and he knew none of his lines. He kept tipping his head down into the script and mouthing the words to himself, for all the world as if he had never so much as seen them in his life. I felt frustration and even anger. It was hard not to take it as a sign of disrespect. After all, he was wasting my time and the time of everyone on set. He was even wasting his own time, of which, I remember thinking maliciously, he did not have a great deal remaining. Perhaps sensing my exasperation, the director pulled me aside and said that the actor was having trouble memorizing his lines and was unlikely to recall any of them, and that I should be prepared for this. I shouldn't expect matters to improve. I looked at him in confusion, and he explained that he had spoken to Stan, the director of Salvation. I should have told you earlier, he said, but the truth is, I only just found out. He can't remember his line. He turned up on the set of Salvation every day without knowing any of them. I gave a short laugh of disbelief, and the director raised his hand as if to stop me. At first, Stan thought it was simply lack of focus and preparation, but quite soon he realized that it was beyond his control. He really couldn't retain the words for even a minute between looking at the script and delivering them from inside the scene. So they stuck notes with the lines on every surface of the set and muddled through. Do you remember the scene in the kitchen when he's running his hands across the counter? That's him looking for his note. Same in the bathroom scene. I stared at the director in disbelief. As it turned out, he continued wryly, the result was genuinely remarkable, and it was on that basis that I cast him in this movie, the one we are now making, or trying to, at least. It was only later that I discovered the true source of the performance's strength, which is the fact that it is no performance at all. That confusion that you see on screen is completely real. You're looking at a man lost, with no sense of what the story is, trapped inside the scene, with a camera lens staring at him. You are watching a man who is seeing his life and his career drift away. But why didn't Stan tell you? I asked. It works for that movie, I admit. And here I stopped and nodded to myself. I admit it works very well for that. But for this... I know, the director said. When Stan told me, I was furious. Why didn't you warn me? I asked him. Stan simply said that he would have felt as if he were betraying the actor. For such a story to become public, for such a story even to circulate within the industry would be fatal. It wasn't that he felt especially loyal to the actor. He was more than happy to complain about his vanity and his bullheadedness. It was in this one regard only that he felt a kind of fidelity. He had even attempted to hide the degree of the actor's impairment from the crew. He had not said that the actor was suffering from dementia, but instead claimed that he had refused to learn his lines, that he was lazy, stupid, words of abuse that were in fact designed to protect the actor, to prevent the others from guessing the terrible truth. You see, the director said, in his way, Stan loved him. Yes, I said, or perhaps it was a performance he loved, and the process of extracting it. On some level, what Stan had done was ruthless and unconscionable. He must have known that he had crossed a moral line, and I couldn't help but feel that it was the secret of that transgression, not the aging actor, not even the reputation of the film, that Stan was so eager to protect. In any case, our film had not replicated the success of Salvation, although the actor continued to muddle through, and work came to him as frequently as before. Probably even now he was somewhere on set, wandering through a scene. At the time, I remember being shocked and also disillusioned by the disclosure. It changed the way I saw the performance. After my conversation with the director, I went back and rewatched the film, and all I could see was a man with incipient dementia, lost on screen, searching restlessly for his lines, for the words he knew he was meant to be saying. But now, as Xavier walked alongside me, it occurred to me that the performance did remain. That is to say, the performance I had experienced the first and even second time I watched the film remained extant, and I thought it was true that a performance existed in the space between the work and the audience, that it existed and was made in that space of interpretation. But then I also thought that if ever an actor had lost sight of the shore, then it was this one. He had stumbled deep into the interior, and I wondered if he worried that he would never find his way out, if the world of fiction had lost its protective powers, the line between reality and invention undone. The confusion and the vulnerability that I had seen on screen was real enough, and I thought again of the panic in the actor's eyes, which was entirely authentic, when he stood in the middle of the set, when he looked at the other actors, the director, for his scrap of paper. In that moment, everything was terribly, terrifyingly real. Because, of course, there was another element to the performance in Salvation, which was death. And although the actor was only in his 60s, as soon as I heard the story of the notes on the counter and the forgotten lines, as soon as I heard this, I was able to envision his death. I was able to imagine the parabolic arc of his decline. I understood that eventually his mind would disintegrate to the point that his memory of the world and of himself would be lost, and with it, everything that formed his being. It was death. That was what we had responded to when we watched him wading through those scenes on screen, even if we hadn't understood it. The film was a portrait of a man in the process of surrender. I no longer knew how I felt about salvation, a work I had previously enjoyed in such a pure and naive way that innocence was gone. I understood all too well what I was seeing, and I wondered also if that wasn't the point of a performance, that it preserved our innocence, that it allowed us to live with the hypocrisies of our desire. Because in fact, we don't want to see the thing itself, on a screen or on a stage. We don't want to see actual pain or suffering or death, but its representation. Our awareness of the performance is what allows us to enjoy the emotion, to keep close to it and breathe in its atmosphere. Performance allows this dangerous proximity. Without it, salvation was only a snuff film. And so I said to Xavier that it did matter. Yes, it did. Without intentionality, there was no agency, no control. The work was happening to you, an impossible inversion. Ah, he said lightly, and he took a sip of coffee. We had arrived at our destination. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you for being here. There's a TV here that shows me, and I need some plastic surgery or something. Hi, let me start. I begin this story with the lie, and like a great whale leading other sea creatures in her wake, it was followed by a whole pod. I wish I can say I had doubts. I didn't. I Jonah that whale, swam right through and settled in. Gullibility and I have always been chummy. In my defense, the offer seemed real, and in a sense it was, and when it arrived, I was desperate. Hook, line, and harpoon, I was in. An organization called the American Excellence Foundation sent me an email on Friday evening, July 23rd, 2021. The foundation was based in the state of Virginia, all the way over in America, and in spite of its name, its mission was supposed to be global, as in, it claimed to be a nonprofit fighting disease, poverty, hunger, and inequity around the world. Impressive, and I was impressed. Particularly with the content of the email. Yada, 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 they were great. Blah, 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 I was great. Yada, 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 and my literary sensibility was both outrageous and excellent, if not exactly American. Blah, 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 so they'd like to offer me a residency at their suddenly restored bucolic farm in central Virginia for 3 months, where they'd board me, feed me, pay me $100 a day, and provide me the space and unfettered time to work on whatever it is I was working on. The only hesitation I felt when I received the email was that I wasn't working on anything. I hadn't worked on anything for more than 25 years, and had no intention of working on anything in the future either. I had written a book, you see, 25 years earlier, but I'm not a writer, not really. I wrote a book. That was it. It was an accident. No, the lie wasn't that I received an offer as a writer and I wasn't. I never claimed to be. I taught French philosophy at a high school. I was 61 years old when the damn offer arrived, and I've been teaching the same class at the same school in Beirut for 36 years. My high school alma mater offered me the job in the summer of 1985 during the middle of the Civil War. I was to start teaching that fall, and I was worried that since I'd be spending most of my time in French, my Japanese might atrophy. I began a writing project in Japanese, an essay dealing with taking long walks in Beirut while the Civil War was on. I thought I'd work on whatever it was that I was writing during the summer and finish it before I started teaching. For the practice, mind you. not just to improve my written Japanese. I ended up working on the project for 9 years. Turned out to be a book of 96 pages. Taking so much time to finish a small book should have been a signal to anyone and everyone that I was not a writer. I wasn't supposed to publish it either. Had no intention of doing so. The writing started out as an exercise which turned into a private endeavor meant to clear my mind, to disentangle my feelings of what happened during the war, to the people, to the city of self. I didn't write about myself at all, just stories of the war and the city. I described battlegrounds, memories, and traumas etched into concrete. Up there was where a sniper camped, shooting no less than 17 people, including Mrs. Barat and Samira, her Ethiopian maid, down the street. The big hole over there was made with an RPG and missed its target by about 20 meters. I wrote it as a Lebanese stroller disconnecting from his surroundings, pretending to be Japanese. The only person who had read any of it was Mrs. Murata, a neighbor who was responsible for my fascination with Japan and had moved back to Tokyo at the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War. I received an email sometime in the 90s from her niece, Himari, informing me that Mrs. Murata has passed away and that she, Himari, had found my manuscript in her aunt's paper. She wondered if I'd allow her to show it to an editor friend of hers. I found out later that she'd already done so long before receiving my permission. A small press published my bizarrerie of a book stupidly titled A Walk with the Japanese Ghosts of Beirut. Through no fault of my own, it did rather well. Okay, it did very well. It became somewhat of a phenomenon in Japan, primarily because of its exoticness. I mean, here was one of those Arabs, barely a level above a brute, who could write a book in our hallowed language. Not that my use of language was beautiful, not baroque or flowery, but simple, like the walks I took, straightforward, but allegedly able to plummet readers into immeasurable depth. Apparently, I'd spent 9 years perfecting the tone that would make the book devastating and excruciatingly poignant. Not that I'd spent 9 years because I found the language so difficult. 9 years trying to light a small fire with the ill-formed, wet branches of my Japanese sentences. Let me stop here. Thank you.
So thank you so much. Thank you both so much for those readings. I want to make sure that we're all okay with the audio.
Should I share it with the others or just from here?
Oh, we're good?
You're the problem.
Oh, no. The problem. Such beautiful, moving, poignant reading. And I want to just kind of jump in, for our conversation. I'm hesitating because I really don't want to overdo it. I don't know what's going on. I think something that's probably all, on all of our minds is the question of what is at stake in writing fiction right now in this moment. And I want to sort of just open with that question. It seems like it's sort of the only place to begin, really. If you can and respond in any way that feels right. But what is at stake in, the work that we do as fiction writers? Why do we write? Why do we write novels in particular? And I'll kind of, refer back to, you've both been asked questions like this. We all have, I think, in the past. And Katie, you've said that you find yourself sort of grappling, especially with students, right? Thinking about why fiction matters. And you said that for you, it matters in part because this is the kind of work that's being targeted so fiercely, but also because the powers that be are trying to take away everything that you love and care about. And Rabih, you said that to write about the human condition is political. It's one of the greatest political acts. Art has never been apolitical. So again, I wonder if we could just sort of start there. Why do we write novels? How do you think of the meanings of your novels and of the practice of fiction writing in this moment? How are you thinking about this today?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think, I remember I was teaching on the day of the most recent election, and my students did say, "What is the point of writing fiction at this particular moment?" And I said then, and I still think, even though the last year has been much worse than I had actually imagined, that I think the role of writing, the role of fiction remains incredibly important. There's a reason why books are being banned. It is in part, of course, the idea that there are certain identities that they are deliberately attacking. But I also think the danger of the book that it is a powerful form of connection between people. And I think a population is easier to subdue and control when it is atomized. And I think a book is a form of very intimate, powerful connection with a stranger that we do almost every single day. The other thing that I felt then, and I continue to feel very strongly, is that language is important, and it is very much the terrain on which a lot of this is being fought. A lot of what has happened from day one has had to do with the control of language and the eradication of certain kinds of language. I think anybody looking at the kind of AI slop that is being put out by the administration understands that style is not lacking in a political dimension, that there is something about the crudity of what is being put out that is highly, highly intentional. It's more than simply unfortunate bad taste. There is absolutely a kind of political dimension to it. So I think when you look at it, even from the kind of scale of what lives, what experiences are being represented, all the way down to the quality of the sentence, I think every aspect of that is political and remains very, very important. So I think the work that we are doing, there are many different kinds of engaging politically, but I think the idea that the novel is no longer relevant is just not something that I feel at all. I feel it's more relevant now than ever.
I agree with everything she said. But let me provide a counterpoint. First, asking what is the purpose of literature, what is the function of a novel or a poem, is a question that should be asked every day. I do. And depending on the time of day, I will give you a completely different answer. Unfortunately, the political situation and the global situation is not terribly pleasant these days. As we speak, my family is being bombed in Beirut. And it makes me wonder, what is the purpose of literature? For the longest time, we have this romantic notion that literature can save the world, or at least I did. I always say it saved me, so I always imagine that it can save the world. But the truth is, it doesn't. Yes, it does, and it doesn't. Because one of the primary objectives of literature is to make, at least for me, to make you live in another person's shoes. And if that's the purpose, then the literature project as we know it has failed. Because we seem to be not just, it was bad 50 years ago, it's 100 times worse now, where we cannot imagine what it's like for Iranians to have their city carpet bombed. We can sort of go, oh, this is bad, but the literature project as we know it has not moved the needle. And we as writers have to look at why. What has failed? If a novel is supposed to make you allegedly more empathetic, how come we're not? Now there's an argument that says, well, we in this room are, but it's them out there. I tend to not see much of a difference between us and them. They're there because we allowed them. So we have to look as writers, have we abandoned our project? Has, capitalism forced us to? Or is the project, we have been looking at it with very, very romantic eyes. And that I have no answers. I always say, I'm a writer, I have no answers, I just whine. So you're about to hear whining for the next 40 minutes.
Well, I want to kind of continue in this vein, right? Because both of you have spoken to, on one hand, the hope, maybe, and perhaps it's a romantic hope, but maybe a necessary sort of romantic hope of literature as something that can create connection, right? Sort of intimate connection, this sense of empathy. And at the same time, is that echo or y'all hearing some fly? Okay. At the same time, there's this sense of reality, right? When we look around, as you said, Rabih, the possibility that that hope has failed or has failed us, or perhaps we have failed in some way. And I wonder, is this a question of a failure of literature, or might it be a failure of literacy? And I ask that question not to sort of invoke us, them, right? We in the room who are doing it right and everyone else who's not. But I guess I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit more about, how the culture of literature and publishing and, the sort of dissemination of language and ideas would need to change for literature to be able to do what we need to hope it can do. And in there, I also have a little bit of a question of like, how do we proceed and move forward as we're questioning that hope, right? What does that look like on the day-to-day for each of you?
I mean, I do sometimes feel like I'm working in an artisanal field to some extent, like I'm crafting a lute. But I like making lutes. So I continue to make lutes, and I think it's a way to spend your life. I mean, the empathy question is a really difficult one, because I think also that there are limits to empathy, and that the assumption of empathy can be somewhat dangerous in a way. I think a lot of, especially in not this book, but in the book that I wrote before, which is set in a war crimes tribunal, a lot of what I was thinking about was the kind of both the seductions and the dangers of identifying with another person, and how that is always complicated, and how in a book that always becomes rarely tends towards resolution, but instead becomes more and more complicated the more you think about the kind of dimensions of empathy. I think what I'm often hoping to do in my work is to resist resolution and to try to write something, and I think I did in a fairly literal way in Audition, where the reader is having to hold a contradiction alive in their head, and the idea of living with contradiction and agitating your brain to work against simplicity and doctrine in a way, because I think, within politics, but also very much within the culture, say, of AI, everything tends towards resolution, everything tends towards simplification, everything tends towards a single sentence that articulates the position. And I think to a certain extent, as a writer, what you're trying to do is to work against that. And I think I see artists in all fields doing that. I talk to my friends who are filmmakers, and they are really trying within the industry and rubric that they've been given to work in to not have the big explosion go off by minute 4 of their first episode of their TV show, and to try to encourage a different kind of attention. But it does seem like things are stacked against us, and what goes from the realm of what we might call entertainment extends and has ramifications all the way through, I think.
What can be done? I'm not sure. One of the things that happened to me about 5 or 6 years ago, probably more now, was that I started thinking, what's the point of literature? And it got bad enough that my psychiatrist gave me, what do you call them? Not antipsychotics, but antidepressants. I think I should need antipsychotics. But anyway, what was amazing, that the transformation that happened wasn't that the situation changed, but that I realized that I like books. I have made writing my project, as Sartre would say. This is my life's work, so that writing, whether it's received or not, is important to me. Um, and reading is important to a lot of people. But you're right. Is it a problem of literacy? Ah, yeah, probably. Uh, which is why um, we need more teachers at an early age. Um, but there's also still, you know, what is, what happened? You know, it's like, why are people not reading? And a lot of it, in my mind, is that we as writers have sort of distanced ourselves from the world we live in. As an example, most of the literature, particularly American literature that we read, is the relationship, say, between two people or a family. One gets a divorce, one husband is cheating on another, which is wonderful. But it always seems to me that it is out of context. Nobody talks about the political system that we live in that would force people to work 24 hours a day with no health insurance. They can be arrested by the police at any time. If you're a minority, you get shot on the street. That doesn't enter our literature. It seems we write the literature, we tend to limit the scope of who and what we are, as if the only thing that we are is the husband cheating on the wife, without any context. And I think that, I might be wrong, but that for me is distancing. That people who are going through trouble, whether you're in Georgia or Oregon or whatever, don't relate to these issues. I mean, they are going through a divorce, but they understand that they're going through divorce. I mean, like I said, almost 90% of all breakups are financial. Yet nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about that we have billionaires who, I mean, like I said, I can whine from here till eternity. I came yesterday, I got to the hotel at like 2:30 and there was no room for me. And, you had to check out at 4. And my first reaction is, how come you don't hire more people? But we never talk about that. We never talk that we're losing the workforce. Everybody's going like AI. It's been happening long before AI. Yet our culture and our art and literature seems to exist for me in a vacuum. And it distances people who are going through stuff to actually be able to identify. But then I think if we complicate our writing more, nobody will read more. So it's a problem. I just don't know how to solve it.
Well, and yet both of you do, in fact, give us these deeply intimate portraits of characters, of relationships, and families within political context, right? Both of you don't hesitate to really invite, as we've said, the reader to kind of inhabit the life of somebody who is navigating interpersonal and even internal conflicts and trajectories and movements in the context of war, colonization, neo-colonization, gender and sexual discriminations, right? And you both give us those, again, deeply intimate portraits of socially contextualized lives. And I want to kind of, sort of expand into a bit of a craft conversation. I'm curious to know how you think about navigating that sort of interplay of the personal and the political as a matter of craft. And you spoke to this a bit, Katie, right, in thinking about the structure of audition, for example. But I'm curious, how do your choices around structure, around point of view, around even setting, how you think about social setting, how does that sort of help you invite the reader into these socially sort of contextualized lives that you evoke so beautifully on the page?
That's so kind of you, Mecca. Thank you for saying that. I mean, I think one of the things that the novel, which is why I do love it as a, I mean, I love it as a form for many reasons. I love it because it's very forgiving. You can make a lot of mistakes in a novel. There's, I mean, there are really no perfect novels, and really great novels are still full of, the best novels are full of, you know, they are the, you know, the baggy, loose monsters of that Henry James described, and that's the kind of magical quality of the novel, is how forgiving it is as a form. But the thing that I think novels do very, very well is to chart the space between the institution in the most broad sense and the individual, and what it means for the individual to be part of an institution. And when I say institution, I mean that truly in the broadest sense. My last book was set, as I said, at a war crimes tribunal that was loosely based on the International Criminal Court. And I think when I started researching that book, I was very preoccupied with the specific history of that institution. You know, the various treaties, where it has jurisdiction, where it doesn't have jurisdiction, the degree to which it can be seen as a kind of neo-colonial institution, very much so, until very, very recently, the only people, leaders who had been put on trial were leaders of African nations as opposed to Western ones, simply because they did not seem to fall within the jurisdiction of the court's activities. But very quickly it became clear to me that actually that power is articulated through language. And the example that I would always use is that the two official languages of the court are French and English, which are both colonial languages, and everything else in order to enter the official record would need to be translated. So then I really found myself thinking about, what does it mean for this character to be working in these particular languages? How is she herself implicated within this superstructure, and how does she think of herself? She thinks of herself as a cog in the machine. How are cogs in the machine nonetheless very much part of the machine? So that became, you know, in the writing, the kind of overarching project of the novel. But I think it was really just that sense of how we are all implicated in the language that we use, and how much power is in language, and the choices that we make all the time as writers, you know, even in terms of what language you choose to work in. Those are very, very loaded choices. So I think looking at choice, each choice that you make as a writer, and seeing how that reflects the history and the power structures that you're working within.
I'll try the craft aspect of it. I don't, when I sit down to write, I don't sit down and think, okay, can I include the institution and its relationship to the individual, or even how can I have these two individuals react? It's usually on a sentence level, trying to make things work. And, you know, do paragraph, and the next paragraph, and then so on. It becomes, quote unquote, political because I am political. Everything I do in some ways is political. So that there is no way that I can write about the world without engaging the world. So that it comes out naturally. I want to say organically. I'm a bastard, and it comes out in my books. I attack things because that's who I am. That does not mean that other writers have to, but who we are comes into the books. And the trouble for me, like I was saying earlier, is that we seem to limit ourselves to this part of ourselves when we're writing, if that makes any sense. And we're this whole universe. But we only, I mean, one of the things that I'm going to misuse it is find your voice. It's like, where was it? Have you lost it? But what most people are saying is you have to limit your voice so that it becomes a writer's voice or your writer's voice. And what I suggest is the voice is you, and you are immense. And that to me is the craft part. Now, obviously, there are things that I do to make a novel work, but they're all things that I do to make a novel work. Did that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I love that response because, in that sort of immenseness, right, there is also complexity. And I think that I'm hearing that in both of your responses, that, accessing a full sort of broad authorial voice and maybe even a narrative voice, and I want to kind of come to that, means accessing a character that is nuanced and is attuned to the multiple dimensions of their own experience. And I think both of you do that extraordinarily well. I'm thinking about how, and Katie, you spoke to this in thinking about the politics of language, right? We work in a medium that is inherently political. And you bring that to the character, or rather to the reader, at least in my reading experience, through voice. Both of you have constructed, especially in your most recent novels, but really across your bodies of work, these really sort of compelling, irresistible, engaging narrators. And I'm using irresistible in the kind of Toni Cade Bambara sense, right? That the purpose of revolution, or the purpose of language, is to make the revolution irresistible. Certainly you do that. It's irresistible in that we connect with your characters through narrative voice. Katie, your narrators are charming in this sort of very sort of intense, sort of distant way, right? That like there's a way in which we want to get closer to your narrators through their uses of voice. And Rabih, especially in the case of the True Story, Raja is immense, right? And as a storyteller, he's so charismatic, he's hilarious. Both of your narrators are sort of characterized, in my experience, by very particular uses of voice. And I'd love to hear you say a bit about how you think about voice. Rabih, you sort of said that it maybe comes to you naturally, it's organic. I wonder if that's the case for you, Katie. And how do you think about voice as a tool, particularly for communicating with and making connections with your reader? Rabih, do you want to go first?
Sure. Let's just say with voice is essential. I mean, how many novels have you started with? You just didn't get into it. And a lot of it has to do with voice. Obviously, it is really hard to separate voice from structure, from plot, from story. This voice has to tell this story. But again, I'm not sure that I do anything specifically to hone a voice. I always joke I have few talents, but one of the talents I know I have is an ear, that I'll be writing, and if something sounds off, I hear it. And that's because, the voice basically takes over, and when it goes off voice, I hear it. But I can't say that this is what I do to achieve a voice. Sometimes I had one novel that took about 2 years. Everything I did with it was shit. And then one day, this old woman came in, and I wrote the book just like that. So a lot of it has to do with finding the right voice.
And so in that moment, it was the voice of the character that...
Oh God, yes. But again, how can you separate the voice from the plot, from the structure? So did the voice come first, or was I writing some sort of story that created that persona? Yeah, but your turn.
I mean, it's there are so many. I mean, Rabih, you're one of them. There are writers who have. I mean, I know there's. I know you just said everything you just said undermine what I'm about to say, but there are writers who just the voices on the page
there. Yeah,
it is just there and it is irrefutable. I mean, Zadie Smith like that. The voice is just there. She's kind of had that voice since she was 22. Yeah. I'm not like that. Not everybody is like that, and I take comfort in that. One of my favorite writers, Javier Marias, he has a very, very distinct voice in his, I would say, from his mid-career through to the end. It's not really there in the early novels. You can see that he hasn't quite articulated that voice. But for me, it's not actually terribly
obvious. And it is something that it is, I suppose, intuitive, but only in the sense that I lack the craft awareness to identify how to make it work. I would say that I guess the one thing I would say is that I've always had a real hesitation around working in first person, because I had a kind of anxiety about the authority of first person. I think the sense of a character who not only knows the story, but knows how to tell the story. And that felt so very far removed from my own subjective experience in the world, where I never know the story and I never know how to tell it. And I think for me, I was only able to write in first person when I was able to instead make it a voice of uncertainty, to destabilize the first person so that it is very much a voice that is not in control of this story, that is looking for this story, that is trying to figure out how to tell this story. And I think that is part of a kind of larger project in kind of trying to loosen the sense that there is only a single reality or a single version of events. And, first person is always unreliable. I think when you emphasize the unreliability, which Rabih does so brilliantly in his novel, but that just helps to remind the reader of that every event is constructed through multiple points of view. And part of what we're trying to do in fiction, but also in life, is to understand that, I see things this way. The novel is saying, do you see it that way? And the answer almost always should be no, in a way. It's that I see it differently. And that's where the kind of tension of reading exists. But I have no craft. Well, I have no craft notes or tips. The only inspiring is maybe the wrong word, but very cheering thing that I can say is that Anthony Marr told me he was working on his second book, and his first book, of course, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, had been this tremendous success. And he said that he would go back as he was working on his second book and look at the very first draft of his first novel, to remind himself that the voice wasn't there immediately, that it was something that he was able to develop over time. And I think that remains the case for me.
Right. And what a terrifying, but also I imagine illuminating exercise, right? To go back to that moment where it wasn't there and think about how you brought it, to the page. I really appreciate that you've mentioned this idea of, first of all, the first person in particular, right? In your most recent novels, both of you are working in the first person in very different ways. And both of you construct unreliable first person narrators, right? In Audition, as you've alluded to, and we sort of saw part of it play out in what you read, Katie, we have a narrator who is telling us quite literally two different versions of a part of her life story. And, structurally, we're sort of guided down one path, and then there's a break, and then we're sort of given the other possible story. And as we've seen in what you shared, Rabih, Raja tells us right away, I lie, right? And this is part of the sort of, the entree into this world of storytelling. And, there are plenty of things that the character sort of misleads us about, and yet the storytelling is so, again, charming, so irresistible, that we're willing to go through the story, even sort of knowing that that truth is maybe porous, right, in both of these novels. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about unreliable narrators, what they say or ask us to think about in terms of belief, right? In both cases, you're asking the reader, inviting the reader to reflect on the precariousness of belief and the act of trust that's inherent in, reading a novel, but also in maybe larger forms of communication through language. So why unreliable narrators? What do unreliable narrators do for us? And what do they ask of the readers? What do they offer our readers?
My question is there any reliable narrator anywhere? I can't imagine writing a memoir. I can't, because I will lie.
Right.
It's just impossible. And the fact that memoirs are supposed to be nonfiction, to me, is such a joke. My memory lies to me. Okay, there is nothing that I remember that actually happen the way that I remember it. Our interpretive skills begin very, very early in childhood. We interpret the world and we begin to see it so that it fits our world. The beauty of unreliable narrator, particularly if they're somewhat aware, is that they're telling the story the way they see it. And hopefully it allows the reader to play the same game, to see, oh, maybe you're lying here. Because we all do. I mean, I could talk about why we believe memoirs is fascinating to me. It's like, or historical fiction that reimagines conversation as if they're happening in today's world. I love them all. I'm not suggesting they're not good. I'm just saying, can we please not call them nonfiction? Or can we please not remove the line between fiction and nonfiction? The reason I write in first person is because I think the biggest liar of them all is the omniscient narrator. The fact that the omniscient narrator this novel is supposed to be told by someone who knows everything about that's going on, to me is a joke. No, please, I'd love the great novels with omniscient narrators. I just can't do them because I feel like I'm actually lying. With a novel in the first person, I am lying and I'm admitting it. I'm from Lebanon. We have a saying that a story, you salt and pepper a story before you serve it. You must lie, otherwise the story will be boring.
Yeah. It makes you think, Katie, of your initial response to the question of the stakes of our writing and style, right? Like, what it means to create a voice that is a living human voice, which is something that the machines can't quite do. That salt and pepper that you're talking about is also kind of politically resonant and necessary, right? That's the context that gives the lie its meaning. But I'd like to hear your...
No, I mean, I agree about third person. The omniscient third person feels to me just, I enjoy it when I read it. It's just impossible for me to write. It feels so fake, true, to me. It's hard as well. It's really, really hard as a form. But I just can't put on the mantle of authority and sit down at my laptop in my pajamas and write. Just nothing about that aligns in the way that I need it to align in order to work. I mean, I asked Karlova Knausgaard why the My Struggle books were novels. And he said, because I'm remembering them. And because they are using the tools of fiction, but mostly because memory is a fiction-making tool in and of itself, which I completely agree with. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting to think about with first person is I think the unreliability is a given and something that every first person writer has to contend with. It's just like how much do you foreground that unreliability? I think the other thing that is so interesting to think about with first person is a level of seduction, because I think so often first person is a seductive voice. It is a voice of charm. You are a storyteller. There is this kind of Scheherazade quality to it. You need to keep the reader's attention. I think with me, especially maybe because I'm writing these female characters, there's a way in which they actually, you were so kind to say that the narrator is charming, because most people find her incredible, all my narrators incredibly uncharming.
No, I love them.
Even though I insist that I am not the I.
Sure, right,
novels, I still find I take it so personally when people are like, I really hated your character. And it's like, oh, I didn't think she was that bad. Or,
she's great.
But that kind of, there is a way in which I think they are all narrators that are slightly hedging a little bit, who are reluctant to engage in the work of seduction because there is a kind of way in which as women they have experienced that as a injunction from the culture around them. So then that's also been very interesting to think about in crafting first person is like, how seductive do you want this narrator to be? What does it mean if you withhold that level of seduction? Then how do you keep them How do you keep the reader engaged? And those are things that I don't know the answers to. Those are the things that with each book, I'm like, I don't know. Maybe the reader won't be. Maybe this time they're going to close the book on page 3. And of course, that happens, of course. But I think it's also the particularity of charm is that nobody's charming to everybody. And it's somewhat the same with books.
Wow. And, I love that you've sort of framed this in terms of a seduction, because we've been talking about what it means to invite the reader into all aspects of a story, right? And in the case of your narrators, I think, in some ways that is part of the seduction is the withholding, and not in a way that is sort of gender normative or patriarchal, but really about, giving the reader a point of entry into a complex interiority that then invites us to want to connect more. And this is the case in both of your work. Since you've raised this question of gender, I also want to, and the notion of seduction and the sensory and sensual. In both of your most recent novels, you're interestingly thinking about questions of gender, of sexuality, in very nuanced, interesting, complex ways, and sex itself, right? And of course, Kitty, your narrator, there's this kind of attenuation of erotic energy that is necessary given the and I don't want to, spoil too much, right? But given the complexity of the potential relationship with the person we might imagine as the love interest. So the erotic is sort of, infused into the language, right? The style, the salt and pepper, maybe, right? The quality of the narration. And then we have, Raja is quite the opposite, right? Sort of speak very frankly about, sexuality. I feel like there's a quote I have to read, right? He's talking about a complicated sexual relationship. And he says, sometimes I was able to do the dishes while he dried before he fucked me senseless. And sometimes he wanted it so urgently that he fucked me on the kitchen counter, right? We get sort of very kind of direct recountings of sexual experience. And, I would love to hear you talk a bit about how you approach, creating a sense of erotic tension, navigating the facts of gender and sexuality. And of course, in the case of Raja, also the context of homophobia, sort of structural, but also interpersonal homophobia, sexual violence, all of these aspects of gender and sexuality, which are part of the lives of your characters, are suffused into voice and language. I'd love to hear how you think about gender, sexuality, and sex in your writing.
This might come as a surprise to most of you, but I'm gay. And this might come as a surprise to most of you, but sex is really important. I cannot imagine a life, I just can't imagine a life without desire. Yet again, we seem to ignore that a lot of times in our writing. I can't. If I'm thinking of a person, old, young, male, female, they have to have desires and think about sex. And I tend to be straightforward about it.
I love it.
But in this book particularly, I was fascinated with the idea of gender. Now again, I don't sit down and think, I'm going to write a book as a woman. How does a woman? I usually just go like, this is this character. How can I make this character real? Not how can I make this character real as a woman? With Raja, there were some complications because I was fascinated, not by transness as much as coding and how we switch genders, like that this guy Booty could not fuck him if he wasn't wearing a dress, and how naturally he went to it. But I was also interested in when the character puts on a dress, does it change the character? I have to say, I went back to, I know this will come as a surprise, but I have dressed in drag.
Hey, you did it.
More than once. A lot. But I remember the first time I did it, actually, it was in Rio, of all places, and it freaked me out because I was a different person. And then, there's this phase where you put the mask on, as I call it, and you become a different person. It took a long time for me to realize that I don't need the wig for the mask, that I can be just fabulous because I'm fabulous.
Yeah.
Raja had to get to that quickly. And so that was what I was interested in how does gender confusion or putting on drag, how does it confuse the issue? And how quickly can one reach there? And, how society looks at that. And that was a biggie for me.
Yeah, I mean, I love sex in books because the reader is very engaged. And there's a lot of the reader. I mean, I'm saying this as a reader.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stepping forward into the world of the book, into your own desire as a reader becomes very much tangled up in both the desire that you're seeing on the page, but also kind of like what you yourself want, right? The kind of rubric of your own sexual desire becomes almost the frame through which you see whatever you're reading on the page. And I think in audition, the audition opens with a scene between this older woman and a younger man, and at that point in the book, the reader does not know what is happening between the two characters. And what was really important to me, because the book is about interpretation for me, and it is about the reader's interpretation, and it is a book that I thought of as kind of being made by the act of interpretation on the part of the reader. I really wanted to hold up a kind of interaction between two characters and have it scan in multiple ways. And I wanted to kind of play into the reader's desire, which is for that relationship to be a sexual or romantic one between these two characters, for the reader to want to see that and to kind of throw that longing onto the page, and then to redirect it in a way towards a taboo, in fact, which is potentially an incestuous relationship, and to kind of think about the way that the reader's expectation and desire are tied together, and how much taboo is a big part of organizing that desire as well. That was how I thought about it in audition. But Rabih's sex scenes are extraordinary, and I'm really trying to write sex scenes in the current project that I'm working on. So I read, in particular.
It's very much.
I love taboo.
It's very much there in both of your works, and just quickly I teach and talk to students a lot about writing sex scenes, and Toni Morrison has a brilliant moment where she talks about that writing sex is difficult because it's just not sexy, right? And unless you sort of withhold and are very selective about what you give. She talks about how you can end up sounding kind of gynecological, right? If you sort of over-explain, and both of you resist that in very different ways. You resist that in the sense of, again, a kind of withholding, a kind of attenuation of energy. And Rabih, I think the directness of Raja, in fact, gives us all of his perspective. But so we have time for one more question. I want to kind of ask you to think about, in both cases, you're writing about artists, right? The narrator of Audition, who's an actor, and then Raja, who is a sort of incidental author, right? But also an immensely talented storyteller, whether he'll sort of claim that or not. And I wonder if you could say a bit about what you might have brought, your perspective as artists, what that might have brought to your portrayal of these characters. But also, is there anything about art making, and again, the stakes or meanings of art making, that you might have sort of started to see differently working with these characters? And in some ways, it's a kind of call back to our first question: what's at stake in the work that we do? How did you change maybe your perspective on that and working on these artist characters?
Thank you for that question. So my last three books all have characters who are interpreters in one way or another. They're all characters who speak the words of other people. They're distinctly not authors or in the positions of authorial control.
but they were all those crafts, whether it was translation, interpretation, or acting, were, I think, just directly ways for me to think about writing.
Yeah.
So everything that those characters say about what interpretation is like or what acting is like, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I just wrote about what it feels like for me to write. I think in terms of how it changed my own experience of thinking about writing, I think, you know, I am friends with a lot of actors, and I talked to a couple of them, but a lot of it was just, I think, information I pick up incidentally along the way. But the sense of the mutability of a performance, I really found myself thinking a lot about how to transmit that into a book, and the fact that a book is so incredibly mutable, which I experience myself. You know, I'm in the process of rereading some books, and I think I don't think I read this book. I don't recall anything about it, and it's not the text that changed; it's me that's changed. And we, like, as readers, we really are the instruments that are being played, not the text, in a way. So that's really wonderful to think about how reading itself is an act of, you know, I think had to think a lot earlier in my writing life about how writing was an act of exposure and how you expose yourself in so many ways when you're writing fiction. I think what I realized with this book is that reading is as well. And in the act of how you read, you are sharing almost everything about yourself.
Yes, a lot of my characters are involved in the arts in one way or another. I do this for a number of reasons, not the least of which is because I can't write about mergers and acquisitions, Kai. I can't write about a politician. Art, I can. But also the other thing that is just as important, there is, you know, politically speaking, for me, and my character has to look at that, is if we find that this world is oppressive, that you know, we do terrible things to people, and the system, you know, helps the few and oppresses the many, how do you participate in it? And for me, and particularly in this book, it was about this character who realizes that he cannot participate in this culture. So his withdrawal is not just the book, but becoming a teacher that's separate from, he does not wish to participate in the culture, or he chooses his own terms to do that. And I think as writers, as much as I make fun of us, it was our way. It's like none of us in this room can become merger and acquisitions guys. It's just not in our nature. The reasons we choose them are whatever, but that I can identify with and I could write about. I don't think I can do the other.
Well, thank you both so much for this conversation. I thought we keep talking for hours, but thank you for the fiction.